It was a cold afternoon on January 15, 2009, at LaGuardia Airport, New York. The terminal was bustling with travelers, some heading home, others on business trips, and a few simply looking forward to a short, uneventful flight. U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320, was preparing for departure, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. For the 150 passengers and 5 crew members on board, this was supposed to be just another routine flight. No turbulence, no delays, just a simple, smooth journey. In the cockpit sat Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles. Sully, a former U.S. Air Force pilot with over 40 years of experience, was well known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. Skiles, though newer to the Airbus A320, was an experienced aviator with thousands of flight hours. Together, they were the kind of crew you'd want flying your plane, competent, professional, and prepared for anything, or so they thought. At exactly 3:25 p.m., the engines roared to life as Flight 1549 rolled down runway 4. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing into the crisp winter sky. The New York skyline stretched out below as passengers settled into their seats. Some pulled out their phones to take pictures of the view, while others closed their eyes, expecting nothing but a peaceful flight. But what they didn't know was that in less than 4 minutes, their aircraft would be completely powerless. And no one, not even the pilots, could have predicted what was about to happen next. At 2,800 feet, just as the aircraft reached its initial climb, it happened. A loud, violent thud echoed through the plane, then another, and another. Passengers gasped as the entire aircraft shuddered. Some looked out the window just in time to see a massive flock of birds, scattering in every direction. Then came the worst sound imaginable: silence. Inside the cockpit, both pilots knew instantly this was a disaster. Both engines had completely lost power. The once powerful Airbus A320, designed to glide effortlessly through the skies, was now falling. Mayday, mayday, mayday! This is Cactus 1549. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back toward LaGuardia. Air traffic control responded quickly, trying to clear a runway, but time was slipping away. The aircraft was descending rapidly, and the pilots had mere seconds to make the most critical decision of their lives. And then Captain Sully spoke the words that no one in aviation history had ever dared to say. We're going to be in the Hudson. The entire fate of Flight 1549 and the 155 souls on board now depended on one impossible question: could a commercial jetliner with both engines dead actually land on water and keep everyone alive? The moment Captain Sully uttered those words, "We're going to be in the Hudson," the entire fate of U.S. Airways, Flight 1549, changed. What had started as a routine departure just moments ago had now turned into a fight for survival. Inside the cockpit, there was no panic, no hesitation, just sheer focus. First Officer Skiles immediately began running through emergency procedures, frantically trying to restart at least one of the dead engines. But deep down, both pilots already knew the truth. This plane was now a glider, and there was no bringing it back to full power. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers had no idea just how bad things were. Many had noticed the loud bangs when the bird struck, and some had even heard the unsettling silence of the engines shutting down. But planes encounter turbulence all the time, and most passengers still believed they were safe. That illusion was about to shatter. From the cockpit, Captain Sully's voice came over the intercom. Calm, steady, controlled. "This is the captain. Brace for impact." Those 4 words sent a wave of terror through the cabin. Flight attendants immediately sprang into action, shouting commands. "Heads down! Stay down! Brace! Brace! Brace!" The realization set in. This was not a normal landing. This was life or death. Back in the cockpit, air traffic control was desperately trying to find a way to save them. LaGuardia's runways were now cleared for an emergency landing, but the aircraft was already too low. There was no way they'd make it back. Then another option: Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. "Cactus 1549, you can land at Teterboro," the controller said, trying to keep his voice steady. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, they could reach it. Sully instantly did the math. They were descending at over 1,000 feet per minute. Teterboro was still miles away. They wouldn't make it. Then his voice came through the radio, firm, unshaken. "We can't do it. We're going to be in the Hudson." Air traffic control fell silent. No commercial pilot had ever intentionally ditched a passenger jet into water and survived. The odds were impossible. Landing on a runway was one thing. Landing on a freezing river in the middle of winter? That was a different story. And yet there was no other choice. Passengers clutched the armrests, their hands trembling. Some whispered prayers. Others closed their eyes, bracing for the unknown. Outside the windows, the massive skyline of New York City loomed closer as the plane descended faster and faster. And then, in just 208 seconds, Flight 1549 was now only moments away from the water. Would the plane hold together on impact? Or would it shatter into pieces, sinking in seconds? Everyone on board was about to find out. 208 seconds. That's all the time Captain Sully and First Officer Skiles had from the moment the engines failed to the moment they would hit the freezing waters of the Hudson River. With every passing second, the Airbus A320 descended faster and faster, and there was no reversing the inevitable. This plane was going down. Inside the cockpit, Sully's hands were steady on the controls. Despite the impossible situation, his training and experience took over. If they were going to survive this, they had to land at the perfect angle. Too steep, and the aircraft would break apart. Too shallow, and it would flip over and sink immediately. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers gripped their seats, some with their heads down, others staring forward in frozen fear. The reality of their situation was sinking in. There was no airport in sight, no runway, just the dark, icy waters of the Hudson River rushing up toward them. Flight attendants continued shouting commands, their voices growing more urgent. "Brace, brace, brace! Heads down! Stay down!" Passengers clung to whatever hope they had left. Some squeezed their loved ones' hands, while others whispered final prayers. No one knew if they would survive the next few seconds. Outside, the city of New York had no idea what was unfolding above them. But for the people near the river, on ferries and office buildings, walking along the waterfront, a chilling sight appeared in the sky. A massive commercial airliner was flying dangerously low, gliding silently over the Hudson. Some thought it was trying to land at an airport. Others realized in horror that something was terribly wrong. The aircraft's descent was rapid but controlled. Sully kept his eyes locked on the water ahead, making tiny adjustments to ensure they landed as smoothly as possible. One mistake and it was all over. They were now just hundreds of feet above the surface. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. The river rushed up to meet them. The freezing wind howled outside. The nose of the plane was slightly elevated, its tail barely clearing the city skyline. And then, impact. The Airbus A320 slammed into the Hudson River, skipping across the surface like a stone being skimmed across a lake. The initial shockwave rattled the entire aircraft, sending a powerful jolt through the cabin. Passengers screamed. The sound of metal scraping against water filled the air. For a moment, it felt like the plane would break apart. The fuselage shook violently, but somehow it held together. The wings sliced through the water, slowing the aircraft. And then, silence. The plane came to a stop. It was floating. Against all odds, Flight 1549 had survived the crash landing. But they weren't safe yet. Water was already rushing into the cabin. The freezing air was unbearable. And now a new question emerged. How would they escape before the plane sank? For a moment, there was silence. Then chaos erupted. The shock of the landing had barely settled when passengers realized the cabin was filling with freezing water. The Airbus A320, though miraculously still intact, had taken heavy damage on impact. The lower sections of the fuselage were already leaking, and water was rushing in fast. The plane was sinking. Panic set in as passengers scrambled to unbuckle their seatbelts. Some had been bracing so hard that they forgot they were strapped in. Others were dazed from the impact, unsure of what to do next. Through the cockpit door, Captain Sully and First Officer Skiles heard the commotion. They had done the impossible, landed a commercial jetliner on water without breaking it apart. But now came the next challenge: evacuating 155 people before the plane sank beneath the freezing river. Sully's voice cut through the chaos. "Evacuate. Get everyone out." Flight attendants immediately sprang into action, throwing open the emergency exit doors over the wings. The cold wind rushed in, and for the first time, passengers saw where they had landed. The middle of the Hudson River, surrounded by nothing but icy water and distant city buildings. Outside, the sight was surreal. A full-sized Airbus A320 was floating in the river, slowly tilting to one side. Nearby ferry operators, police boats, and bystanders on shore were watching in stunned disbelief. Inside, passengers climbed over seats, waded through knee-deep water, and pushed toward the exits. Some grabbed life vests from under their seats, while others had no choice but to cling to whatever they could find. The wings of the plane became makeshift rafts. As people climbed onto the slippery metal surface, they huddled together for balance. Some slipped and fell into the freezing river. The shock of the cold waters stole the breath from their lungs. Others were too terrified to jump in. They clung to the doorway, looking at the icy river below, paralyzed by fear. Then, an even bigger concern, the aircraft was tilting more and more. If it rolled over, it would pull everyone under. Time was running out. From the cockpit, Captain Sully took one final look around. He walked through the sinking plane twice to make sure no one was left behind. Only after confirming that every single passenger and crew member had made it out did Sully finally step onto the wing himself. Now, all they could do was wait for rescue. But in the freezing January air, with some passengers already suffering from hypothermia, one question remained: would help arrive in time? The freezing wind cut through the soaked passengers as they clung to the wings of the sinking Airbus A320. Some were standing, balancing carefully on the slippery metal surface, while others had already fallen into the Hudson River, struggling to stay afloat in the near-freezing water. The air was filled with shouts for help, gasps for breath, and the sound of the current lapping against the aircraft. Captain Sully, standing on the wing, scanned the scene, making sure everyone was accounted for. His uniform was drenched, his face calm but focused. He had done the impossible, landed a jetliner on water without losing a single life. But now a new challenge began: survival. The Hudson River was brutally cold, just 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius. Exposure to such temperatures for just a few minutes could lead to hypothermia, numbness, and even unconsciousness. The passengers were soaked, shivering, and exhausted. Some were in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. Others were focused only on one thing: getting out of the water before it was too late. And then, hope appeared on the horizon. The first ferry boat, the Thomas Jefferson, changed course at full speed toward the floating aircraft. Other vessels, including New York waterway ferries, police boats, and even private boats, had seen the crash and were racing to help. Rescue teams wasted no time. As soon as they reached the plane, crews threw life rings, ropes, and extended ladders to the passengers. Some were too weak to climb, their bodies frozen and shaking. Rescuers pulled them up with their bare hands, wrapping them in blankets as soon as they were on board. For those still in the water, every second mattered. One man, who had jumped into the river in panic, was now barely able to move. His body had gone completely numb. A ferry crew member saw him and dove into the icy water to pull him to safety. Meanwhile, more boats arrived, surrounding the plane. Emergency responders helped passengers from the wings, moving as fast as possible. Some people had to be hoisted up with ropes, while others were pulled in through windows of the ferries. Inside the cabin, water was rising fast. A few stragglers were still inside, too weak to move on their own. Firefighters and police boarded the plane, stepping into knee-deep freezing water to carry them out. The Airbus A320 was now sinking faster. The nose dipped below the surface, tilting dangerously. Water gushed in through the broken fuselage. The aircraft had held together against all odds, but now it was losing the battle against the river. Passengers were still being rescued, but the rescuers knew they had to hurry. The water was rising. The plane was going under. Would they be able to save everyone before it was too late? The rescue effort was now a race against time. The Hudson River was winning. The Airbus A320 was sinking faster and faster, tilting forward as water poured into the cabin. Passengers who had escaped onto the wings held on for dear life, their bodies numb from the freezing air and water. Some were still trapped inside, too weak or too terrified to move. The rescue boats had arrived, but the situation was still critical. Not everyone was out yet. On board the ferries and police boats, rescue teams were working frantically to pull people from the water and the wings of the aircraft. Some passengers were in severe shock, barely able to move. Others were so cold that they couldn't even hold on to the rescue ladders without help. Every second mattered. Captain Sully was still on the wing, making sure no one was left behind. He refused to leave until the last passenger was safe. He had landed the plane. Now he was making sure every soul on board survived. But the plane was losing its battle with the river. The nose dipped beneath the surface, dragging the aircraft down. Inside the cabin, water had reached the seats, making it impossible to go back in. The last few passengers were now in the hands of rescuers, being lifted onto ferries, shivering and soaked, but alive. Rescuers worked quickly, moving from one passenger to the next. Some were unconscious from the cold, their bodies barely responding. Blankets were wrapped around them, and medical teams on board the boats checked for signs of hypothermia. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Captain Sully, the last person still on the plane, finally stepped onto a rescue boat. He had walked through the sinking aircraft twice to make sure no one was left behind. Only after confirming that every single passenger and crew member was safe did he leave. At that moment, the city of New York watched in awe. A plane had crash-landed in the Hudson, and every single person had survived. Minutes later, the Airbus A320 slipped further into the water, its tail still visible above the surface. Soon, only a small part of the aircraft remained, floating for a while before disappearing beneath the river. The plane was gone, but all 155 souls on board were safe. The passengers, now wrapped in dry clothes and blankets, were transported to hospitals, ferries, and emergency centers. Most were suffering from severe cold exposure, but they were alive. The news spread like wildfire. The world watched in disbelief as reports confirmed the impossible. A commercial airliner had ditched in a river, and everyone had survived. The media soon gave it a name, the miracle on the Hudson. But was it really a miracle? Or was it the skill and experience of one pilot that saved 155 lives? As the passengers and crew were brought to safety, the world was in shock. A commercial airliner had crash-landed in a river, and yet no one had died. The media quickly called it the miracle on the Hudson, and Captain Sully was being hailed as a hero. But in the days that followed, questions started to arise. Could Flight 1549 have made it back to an airport? Did Captain Sully make the right choice to land in the Hudson River, or was there another option? The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an immediate investigation. Black box recordings, flight data, and eyewitness reports were all analyzed to understand exactly what happened in those 208 seconds. At first, some experts believed that the plane could have made it back to LaGuardia or even to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Flight simulators were used to recreate the event. Test pilots, using the same conditions as Flight 1549, attempted to turn back to LaGuardia. The results were shocking. In several simulations, pilots were able to land at an airport without crashing. This raised a huge debate. Was Sully's water landing unnecessary? Did he panic and choose the river too quickly when he might have made it back to a runway? But then, Sully himself made a crucial point. The test pilots in the simulation already knew what was coming. They knew the engines would fail. They knew they had to turn back. But Sully and Skiles had no warning in real life. They had to assess the situation, communicate with air traffic control, attempt a restart, and make a life or death decision, all within seconds. The NTSB adjusted the simulations to account for real-world decision-making time. And once those extra few seconds of delay were added, every test ended the same way. The plane crashed before reaching the airport. There was no way they could have made it. The final report confirmed it. Captain Sully had made the only possible choice. By landing in the Hudson, he saved 155 lives. The investigation ended with one undeniable conclusion. This wasn't just a miracle. This was a masterful display of aviation skill, experience, and leadership. Captain Sully wasn't just lucky. He was the right pilot, in the right place, at the right time. The NTSB report confirmed what many already believed. Captain Sully had made the right choice. There was no way Flight 1549 could have made it back to an airport safely. Every single passenger was alive because of his quick thinking, calm decision-making, and years of experience. But the story of Flight 1549 didn't end there. In the weeks after the crash, passengers struggled to process what had happened. Some described feeling overwhelming gratitude, knowing they had narrowly escaped certain death. Others suffered from survivor's guilt, asking themselves, why did I survive when so many others in similar crashes didn't? Many passengers formed lifelong friendships, bonded by the fact that they had all lived through something extraordinary. Meanwhile, Captain Sully and First Officer Skiles faced intense media attention. Sully, who had always been a private and humble person, suddenly found himself on the front page of every newspaper and invited to television interviews. People around the world were calling him a hero, but Sully didn't see himself that way. In an interview, he simply said, "I was just doing my job." Yet his job had saved 155 lives. Soon after, he was invited to the White House, where he and his crew were honored for their bravery. The passengers and their families personally thanked him, many with tears in their eyes, knowing he had given them a second chance at life. But even as the world celebrated, the aviation industry was making serious changes. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and NTSB immediately revised pilot training programs, incorporating new emergency water landing procedures. Additionally, airlines around the world started investing in better bird strike prevention systems, studying how to improve engine durability to withstand multiple bird impacts. Flight 1549 also changed how pilots are trained for crisis situations. Sully's handling of the emergency became a case study in aviation schools, teaching new pilots how to stay calm under pressure and make critical decisions in seconds. As for the plane itself, the Airbus A320 was eventually pulled from the Hudson River and placed in a museum, the Carolinas Aviation Museum, where it remains a symbol of one of the greatest survival stories in aviation history. But beyond the fame, beyond the headlines, the real legacy of Flight 1549 is what it proved to the world. Not every plane crash has to end in tragedy. With the right leadership, the right training, and the right decisions, sometimes even the impossible can happen. That day, 155 lives were saved in just 208 seconds. And the world would never forget it. The miracle on the Hudson became one of the most studied and celebrated aviation events in history, not just because of the perfect execution of an emergency water landing, but because it changed the way the world viewed air safety. For the 155 passengers and crew members, the events of that day never left them. Many spoke about how surviving Flight 1549 transformed their lives. Some changed careers, others deepened relationships with loved ones, and a few even developed a new outlook on life, realizing how fragile and precious every moment truly is. One passenger, a businessman who had been traveling for work, said, "I used to focus only on my career. After the crash, I realized I had spent too much time away from my family. That day changed everything for me." Another survivor recalled how, in the chaotic moments before impact, he had prayed for one more chance to live, a chance he was given. Many passengers stayed in contact with each other and with Captain Sully, forming an unbreakable bond. Some even reunite every year on January 15th to remember the experience that connected them forever. But as the passengers moved forward with their lives, Captain Sully's journey was far from over. He became an international speaker, traveling the world to discuss aviation safety, crisis management, and the power of staying calm under pressure. His story became an inspiration not just to pilots, but to leaders in every field. In 2016, the story of Flight 1549 was turned into a Hollywood film, Sully, starring Tom Hanks. The film depicted the dramatic events of that day, the investigation that followed, and the mental weight that Sully carried, knowing how close they had all come to disaster. Despite the worldwide attention, Sully remained the same humble pilot he had always been. He never took sole credit for the landing, always emphasizing the teamwork between him, First Officer Skiles, the flight attendants, the passengers, and the rescuers. When asked what he learned from that day, he once said, "The important lesson is that we all have the ability to rise to the occasion, to help others, to make a difference. It was not just about me. It was about all of us working together. Beyond Sully, Flight 1549 left a permanent impact on the aviation world. It led to, checkmark, better emergency landing procedures for water in urban areas, stronger bird strike prevention measures near airports, more advanced training for pilots in crisis decision-making. Most importantly, it reminded the world of one critical fact. Air travel is incredibly safe, not because accidents don't happen, but because pilots and flight crews train for the impossible. What happened on the Hudson wasn't just a lucky escape. It was proof that experience, skill, and teamwork can turn a disaster into a miracle. And for the 155 people who lived through it, that miracle will be something they carry for the rest of their lives. 14 years later, the story of U.S. Airways Flight 1549 remains one of the greatest aviation survival stories in history. It wasn't just about a plane crash. It was about leadership, teamwork, and the power of human resilience in the face of disaster. In just 208 seconds, 155 people went from routine travelers to survivors of an event that defied the odds. It was a day that tested every emergency procedure, every piece of pilot training, and every rescue system in place. And against all expectations, everything worked exactly as it needed to. But the real story of Flight 1549 isn't just about the landing. It's about what came after. The passengers who walked away from that floating aircraft carried something more than just a story. They carried a newfound appreciation for life. Many described how that day made them realize just how fragile everything is, and how quickly everything can change. For the crew members, it was a moment that redefined their careers. The flight attendants, whose job usually involved serving drinks and ensuring seat belts were fastened, had suddenly become life-saving first responders in the most extreme conditions. For First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, it was the moment he realized that split-second decisions and years of training had saved them all. And for Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger, it was a moment that transformed him from a veteran pilot into a legend. But Sully never called himself a hero. Instead, he credited his training, his co-pilot, his crew, and the first responders, the people who stepped up when it mattered most. He often reminded the world that this wasn't just about one person. It was about an entire system of people working together to save lives. In a world where aviation disasters often end in heartbreak, Flight 1549 stands out as a story of hope. It's proof that sometimes, even in the face of impossible odds, survival is possible. And while we may never know when a life-changing moment will come, what truly matters is how we respond when it does. This was not just a miracle, it was a testament to human courage and skill. And because of it, air travel became safer than ever before. So now we leave you with one question. What would you have done if you were on Flight 1549? Would you have stayed calm, or would panic have taken over? Let us know in the comments below. If you love aviation stories, shocking air disasters, and survival tales, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Want more gripping flight investigations? Stay tuned for more real-life aviation mysteries and incredible survival stories, only on Crash Plan Diaries. Because every flight has a story, and some stories must never be forgotten.